Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to today's video. I'm going to be showing a game that I played with the white pieces. I opened e4 and my opponent played b6, the O in defense. Don't get me started on b6 or g6, or if you're white, you start the game with g3. These Fia and Keto openings are so annoying because who knows how to play against them. And in this position, I really thought I should abort this game, but chess.com has a limited number of aborts, so I actually couldn't. And I really considered resigning in this position, but my pride wouldn't let me, so I continued. I have no clue what to play. I played d4, just continuing in the center, and he played bishop to b7, Fia and Ketoing his light square bishop, as we just discussed. He's also going after my pawn, so I played knight to c3. He played e6, and I played f4. I have no clue what I'm doing, but f4 with the idea of then developing my knight, my bishop to maybe e3, and then my queen, and then castling queen side, and then I would be able to start an attack on the king side. Anyways, this guy, he played bishop to b4, and I played bishop to d2. And this is the position from the thumbnail with the meme. Let me show you guys. Basically, it's, can we stop and get some pawn sacrifices? Mom, we have pawn sacrifices at home. Pawn sacrifices at home is basically this position, and I will show you the pawn sacrifice. He played bishop captures on c3. I played bishop captures on c3, and he played bishop captures on e4. And there is no pawn sacrifice. I just blundered a pawn. So anyways, I played bishop to d3, hoping that he'll capture my bishop and I could, exchange and castle queenside. My development would be slightly better. But here, I blundered another pawn. He goes bishop captures on g2. And I'm sitting here, I was like, I should have resigned the game before. Well, the second he played b6, I should have resigned the game. But I continued. I played queen to g4, going after the bishop, and going after this pawn. So the idea is if you take my rook, I will take your pawn and then take your rook. So he takes my rook, and I played queen captures on g7. Right here, he probably should have played queen to h4 check, and then forced my king to move. But instead, that is definitely the most precise idea. But instead, he played queen to f6. And queen to f6 is actually a slight inaccuracy. It gives me this, the idea is that I can't capture the rook because my queen would be hanging. And if I capture the queen, he gets to develop his knight, and now I'm just down a rook. But I have this interesting d5 idea. And after d5, he plays queen captures on g7, bishop captures on g7, knight to e7, and I played bishop captures on h8. I took his rook back. Right now, I'm only down one pawn, so I'm figuring the game is still playable. My bishop's on this insane diagonal, so maybe there's going to be some counterplay later. He plays knight captures on d5, just grabbing more material. He does have pretty solid pawns in the center, whereas I have this lone f4 pawn that's actually probably going to get taken soon. I go bishop to e5 to defend it. This is a really, really stupid move by me. I don't really know what I'm doing, because I literally encourage him to play f6 or d6 with tempo, which he does. He plays d6. I play bishop to d4. Another really, really stupid move. He plays knight captures on f4. I grab back my pawn, bishop captures, with the idea that I can create this passed pawn and just keep pushing it. Maybe. I don't know. And again, bishop to d4 stupid, because now he plays e5 with tempo, and I have to move it again. This is like the third time moving it in the last 4 moves. And he plays knight to d7, just continuing his development. Probably going to shift the knight to f6 or c5 even. c5 to e4. My knight can't really move because the bishop's guarding it, and the knight is guarding these 2 squares. And I don't really want to play my king up, because I kind of want to castle queenside still. But maybe it's not a bad move to just develop the knight, exchange, and then bring my king up. But he castles Oh, he just played. I castle queenside, and then he castles queenside. And here I go h4. Just, I want to push my passed pawn. This is the only good thing going for me in this game. I'm down 2 pawns. And he has 2 connected passed pawns. He should continue his push his pawns as well. He goes knight to f6. And knight to f6 is a questionable move for him. Because basically, after this queenside castle, I have this idea of bishop captures on e5. If this knight ever moves, which it just did, I have this idea of bishop captures on e5, and after captures, gotta capture the rook. But the king is guarding it, right? So first, I played bishop to f5. With this idea, I hope he moves, so then his rook will be hanging, and I can grab this pawn for free, which is what he does. He plays king to b8. Probably better was knight blocks on e6, or even just knight back to d7. But playing knight back to d7, although the most precise move, it just feels so bad because you played knight to f6 just to play knight to d7. A little counterintuitive, although the best move. Instead, my opponent played king to b8, and I continued bishop captures on e5 immediately. So I have a double attack on the knight, and this bishop cannot be accepted because the rook is hanging. So he goes knight 4 to h5, wants to protect this knight, and this is exactly what I was hoping for. I was hoping he would move this knight and not this knight, because now I can finally develop my knight to e2. He goes bishop to f3, pinning my knight. And here I'm thinking if I go something like rook to d2, this is losing immediately, because after rook to e8, and if I exchange these pieces, now my knight is under attack, and the only way I can play something like bishop to d3 or king to d1. And if I go king to d1, although my knight is protected twice, this is pinned. This is effectively pinned because I can't move my rook. Even if I move my king here, the knight is still pinned, and then I would just be really far behind. Yeah. So if we go back, after this bishop to f3 move, I played bishop captures on f6. He goes knight captures on f6, and I played a rook to e1. Just protecting my knight. He goes rook e8, but this is a pretty precise idea, and I go king to d2, just guarding my knight. I'm actually hoping right here, although I'm down a pawn, my king is really active, and his king is in the middle of nowhere. So I'm hoping we exchange everything right here. And this is exactly what happens. He goes bishop captures, rook captures. Right here, he should play rook h8 to grab this pawn, but he captures my rook. And after king captures, now suddenly, although he's up a pawn, I have a bishop to a knight. The bishop is usually better in the endgame. But it's still anybody's game because, I'm down a pawn. My passed pawn is much faster than his, though. So, and again, his king is really in the middle of nowhere. He can't even go to c8 because the bishop nicely slices that. So he pushes c6. I'm going to bring his king in a different way. I go king to f3, king c7, king f4, king d8, and king to g5, attacking his knight, and he goes king to e7. And this is great for me now. Because I know this passed pawn will be able to make it all the way, and the only way that he can stop this passed pawn is if he gives up the knight. So I just keep pushing. h5. He plays knight to g8, which is probably not the best idea. The best idea is probably something like knight to d5 to just go after maybe these pawns. I'm not exactly sure. And after I play bishop to e4, now he can bring his king into the game. And because this is an h-pawn, h-pawns can't promote if the king just sticks himself in the corner. And the promoting square is not a light square, it's actually a dark square. So if he can get his king there, this pawn can never promote. And it's the same with the a pawn. The a and h pawns, you can't promote in a king pawn versus king kind of endgame. But instead, he goes knight to g8. I go h6, and I realize that now he has to give up the knight. And once he gives up the knight and I capture, his king will be in a better position, but I have a bishop. So I'm like favored, but this is most likely going to be a drawn endgame, especially in blitz where I don't have a lot of time left. But in the he did not go for knight captures on h6. Rather, he played king to f8, and it's probably over now. Because after h7, my opponent, you cannot let you cannot let me play h8 and get a queen. So you have to play king to g7. And now I just queened my pawn. And he captured. Oops, he captured. And basically, instead of my king being on this square and his king being on e7, now my king is on g5 and his is on g8. So he should have just captured the pawn earlier with his knight. I played king to f6. He went king to f8. I played king to f6 to stifle the movement of this pawn. And now that it's on a light square, I plan to play bishop g4, bishop h5, and grab it. He goes c5, and I played bishop to h5. He goes king to e8, bishop captures with check. He goes king d7, and I played c4. So this is a really interesting position because he did it right. This is what you're supposed to do when you're against a light squared bishop. Put all your pawns on dark squares. And in theory, if his king is protecting the pawn, my king can never capture the pawn, and my bishop is obviously can't either. And I'm gonna show you guys how I exploited that. He goes king to c6. I played b3 with the idea of a4 to clog up the position. My goal right here is to prevent this king from defending this pawn. And this, basically, I have to put black in zugzwang, which is where it's black's move, and he has no good move. I'll explain it a little more when we get into the position. But he goes b5, and here I played bishop to e8 check. He goes king to b6, I capture his pawn, and he goes a6. I go back to e8, bishop to e8, and he plays king to a5, maybe trying to go here, here, here. I stopped that idea with a3 though, and he goes king to b6. I finally go after his pawn, king to e6, and he plays king c7. So right here, I played bishop to d7 with the idea that his king can now no longer move without and still defend this pawn at the same time. So he goes a5, a4, and this is the position of zugzwang where the black king has no good moves, and because it's black's turn, he has to move. So when he moves away from the pawn, then I can capture it. You have to make sure you be careful, or he could push this pawn, but that's just losing. When you put black in zugzwang, or your opponent in zugzwang, you have to make sure that he has legal moves, because right here, black can easily trap white if white's goal has been to capture the d6 pawn, but if black goes king d8 and white captures this pawn, the game's actually drawn. The black king has no more moves. This is draw by stalemate. So when you put your opponent in zugzwang, you have to make sure they have legal moves to avoid this position or to avoid stalemate. This is not what happened though. He played king to b6, and after I captured on d6, my opponent resigned the game. I just wanted to show you this game because, well, I blundered a pawn in the beginning and probably should have lost a little bit more, but after trading off all in pieces, the position of your king is super, super important in the endgame because after you trade queens and rooks and knights and bishops even, the king's the strongest piece on the board. And because my king was so active while his king was stuck on b8, he lost the game because I had a passed pawn that I was pushing while my king was much closer to help. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will catch you guys in the next one.